Hello and welcome to our new lecture on Sons and Lovers by D.H. Lawrence. This lecture is going to discuss Chapter 2, The Birth of Paul and Another Battle. Without further ado, let's get started. Mr. Morel feels ashamed for bullying his wife. He also realizes her hard work and begins to be somewhat more helpful. One morning, Mrs. Morel summons her neighbor, Mrs. K, by banging on the back of the fireplace with the poker and tells her to fetch Mrs. Bauer, the midwife. She gives birth to a boy and who is very ill. Her husband comes home and is told by Mrs. Bauer that he has a son. He asks her for a drink and then, after he has had his dinner, goes up to see his wife and son. We are then introduced to Mr. Hatton, the congregational clergyman, who comes to visit Mrs. Morel every day. One day, Morel comes home while he is still visiting and begins to make a scene by enumerating the difficulties of working in the mine. Mrs. Morel feels disgusted by her husband's tendency to play for sympathy with those around him. هذا التصرف باستجداء عطف الناس بأنه يعمل كثيرا وأنه عمله مضني أثار حفيظة ميسيس موريل زاد من غضبها تجاه زوجها. In this chapter, the way the narrative perspective shifts between characters is illustrated by a brief shift to Mr. Morel's perspective. He insists to himself that the quarrel is Mrs. Morel's fault. This chapter also served the purpose of providing more examples of the battles between Mr. and Mrs. Morel. It also contains a few examples of the themes that have already been noted. One evening, after a quarrel with her husband, Mrs. Morel takes Annie and the baby and goes for a walk near the cricket fields. She seems at peace and feels strongly for her baby son. She has a sudden instinct to call him Paul. This is the point where Mrs. Morel starts paying more attention to her baby child, Paul, and get even further from her husband. The next major issue between the Morels begins when Walter, Mr. Morel, comes home late and drunk again and accidentally pulls out a kitchen drawer in his haste to get something to eat. When his wife tells him she will not wait on him, he becomes enraged and flings the drawer at her, cutting her forehead on the corner of the drawer. For the few days after this incident, Morel refuses to get out of bed. When he finally gets up, he immediately goes to the Palmerston, one of his favorite bars, and this is where he spent the next several nights. One night, however, he finds himself out of money and therefore takes a sixpence from his wife's purse. She noticed that it is missing and confronts him, upon which he becomes very indignant. He then goes upstairs and returns with a bundle and says he is leaving. ذهب إلى غرفته وحزم أغراضه وكان في نيته المغادرة وعدم العودة نهائيا. Mrs. Morel feels sure that he will return that night, but she begins to get worried when he has not returned by dark. However, she finds his bundle hidden behind the door of the coal shed and begins to laugh. Morel sulkily returns later that evening and his wife tells him to fetch his bundle before going to bed. Mr. Morel also reflects that having his family around him at meals make the meals less pleasant. This suggests that Morel prefers to be separated from his family, in contrast to his wife, who lives for her children. This reflects that Mr. Morel cannot handle the burden of his family and to see that they count on him in their living. There are a few critical points that you need to think about when you read and study for this chapter. First, it's what is to be the reason for Mr. Morell's drinking habit? Do you suggest that it is because of the high burden that he cannot handle? Is it because the low paid work that he has? Discuss it. It's just for you to think about when you read this chapter or this when you see this lecture. The second question is, do you think that the action of Mr. Morell's temper and drinking habit are justified? Do you think that due to the financial issues and work issues and the family that is getting bigger and bigger every year is enough as a reason that Mr. Morell acts in this way of drinking, leaving home, being angry at his wife all the day? What do you think? Question 3, why Mr. Morell would prefer to be away from his family? Is it because that he wants them to be away from his eyes? Because whenever he sees them, he will remember that he is in charge of his family and that he has the responsibility towards them. Think carefully about these questions and critically analyze them during your reading and listening to this lecture. In regard to the important quotations of this chapter, we have here 3 quotations. The first one is, she had felt that more or less what he did to himself, he did to her. Her living depends on him. There were many stages in the ebbing of her love for him, but it was always ebbing. This is said by the narrator describing the feeling of Mrs. Morell towards her husband and how her love towards him was fading because he was so ignorant and he didn't pay the right attention to his family. The second quotation, and I quote, she thrust the infant forward to the crimson, throbbing sun, almost with relief. She saw him lift his fist, then she put him to her bosom again, ashamed almost of her impulse to give him back again whence he come. This is said by the narrator as well, describing Mrs. Morell holding Paul towards the sun, as if she was trying to say, well, take it back again from me. She was having a great burden and it was so hard on her and she couldn't handle more. But due to the irresponsibility of her husband toward his family, she had to take all the burden of her children and she can't handle more. But again, she just, at the end, she regrets what she has done and said within her, and she holds Paul again back to her body with all the passion of the mother. The third quotation is starting by saying what he had in her purse was all the money she possessed, but that he should sneak it from her thus was unbearable. He has done so twice before. This is going to be left for you because I already explained this quotation within the presentation, within my lecture. So that's it for our lecture today, and I will see you in the next one.